What's up, guys? Welcome back to another week of Travel Dogs. This week, we're actually going to be talking about something a little bit different. We're going to be comparing tiny houses to RVs. Which one's better and which one would suit your lifestyle more? Let's find out.
We got a chance to stay at a tiny house up in Leadville, Colorado, and it was a great experience, but there are a few key things that we'd like to point out. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and ring the bell for notifications. All right, let's get into the video.
So to start it off, let's first talk about RVs, because we're a little bit more familiar with an RV. Obviously, we've done it a little bit longer. Some of the things we'll talk about are going to be more opinionated and more subjective, while some of these things are going to be a little bit more objective about RVs and tiny houses as a whole. So obviously you might have a tiny house or an RV that might not fit the norm of what we're talking about. So to start off with positives of living in an RV, the most obvious positive that an RV has that a tiny house doesn't is that it is more mobile. It moves, it comes with wheels, it's ready to go. That's what it's designed for.
Yeah, while tiny houses are mobile, they're not really efficient at moving around. So definitely a win in the RV department if you're wanting to move fast all around the country.
You're definitely not going to want to travel as often in a tiny house as much as you would be able to in an RV or a trailer or a van.
Another positive for RVs are that they're a little more easy to get insured. When you're building a tiny house, it doesn't necessarily fall into a mobile vehicle, but it also doesn't fall into a single-family residence as well. So there's much more readily available insurance if you're interested in getting into that market, whereas you're gonna have to do a little bit more research, get a little bit more creative, and really dig in deep to try and get a good policy for your tiny house.
Yeah, it's definitely going to take a little more legwork to figure out insurance for a tiny house, and depending on where you live, it might be a little bit more of a challenge. So definitely a major factor to consider when getting a tiny house versus an RV. Make sure that you can figure out insurance, because it's definitely important. The next positive for an RV is going to be that on the whole, they're typically going to be a little bit more affordable than a tiny house is given square footage. So if you're looking at a similarly sized RV to a similarly sized tiny house, chances are that tiny house, it might be double or even triple the cost of what that RV is.
Now, obviously, if you're buying an RV new, they can tend to get pretty pricey, but generally it's pretty commonly known that you're not supposed to buy a new RV because they're built very poorly nowadays with the intent that you're going to get the warranty work done. So we always recommend to buy at least 2 years used.
If not more.
If not more. Sure. I mean, we're rocking a 21-year-old rig and we love it. So
yeah, we say kind of if you can find one in good condition, vintage RVs are definitely the way to go if you're going the RV route. And yeah, that definitely sells home this point that you can get something for way cheaper if you're going with the vintage RV compared to a tiny house.
Now, generally on the whole, RVs are a little more available when it comes to a market for them. This has kind of changed since COVID started. A lot more people have been RVing and those are kind of on back order. But tiny houses equally have gone up in popularity, and they're still more of a newer concept to where there's not 20-year-old tiny homes in circulation that somebody might have had a good life with and is looking to get rid of. So it's important to consider the volume of product on the market as well, and the market value for those different items.
And obviously this can vary depending on your location as well. So do a little bit of research in your location, but definitely take into account that it might be a little bit harder for you to find a tiny house than an RV.
All right, let's switch over and talk about some positives for the tiny house.
So one of the things we loved when staying in the tiny house is it's definitely got more of a homey style feel. Now, this is a little bit of a subjective opinion, but there is something about having a more house-like structure with the, little A-frame style roof that really does make you feel a little bit more like you're in a home and not in an RV. So depending on who you are, that may or may not be important to you, but it's definitely a sell for some people.
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of unique aspects of being in a tiny house. You can definitely tell just based on the fact that there's multiple floors that you are not in an RV. And, for some people, this might be a positive if you have kids or what have you. But for us with dogs, it definitely was sort of a drawback because they had a hard time going up and down the stairs.
Yeah, typically the tiny house stairs aren't set up like a regular staircase. They're a little more steep because of the size of the tiny house.
Another benefit of a tiny house being that it doesn't have to be on the road is they're a lot more customizable. They're not built on a manufacturing floor assembly line. They are built like a house by a person, given with care, and generally they're built to last. So if you buy a tiny house, it's got a long shelf life, just like a house probably would.
So that's kind of a 2-in-1 for the tiny houses. They're a little bit more unique and customizable, and their quality is typically going to be a little bit better. Granted, if you're customizing a van, you could obviously make it a little bit more unique to you, but we're just talking on the whole if you're not looking for a big renovation project.
Another positive of the tiny house is that they really have more weather resistance than an RV might have. RVs really, leaks are common, electrical issues are common, and that's all because you're driving your house, I said before, 70 miles an hour down the road. It creates issues. And so you really are going to get something that's built to last with a tiny house.
Yeah, the weather resistant might not seem like a big deal if you haven't done this before, but there's so many issues once you start talking about leaks and mold and stuff like that in an RV, and it's not as common of a problem in tiny houses. So something to keep in mind, unless you have your eye on an Airstream, those things are definitely weather resistant. One of the other positives of a tiny house is if you haven't done a tiny living style yet, there probably is going to be a little bit less of a learning curve with a tiny house than there would be with an RV. There's a lot of differences when you're talking about RVs compared to regular household living that you might already be used to. So transitioning to a tiny house is probably going to be a lot easier than transitioning into an RV. Now let's talk about some of the things about tiny houses and RVs. If you've done neither, 2 things you're going to want to definitely consider. One being super obvious. You're downsizing. It's going to be tinier, and that's going to be an adjustment in and of itself. It's not a lifestyle that everybody wants, and it's definitely, even if you want it, it's still going to be an adjustment.
One thing you might like to consider when downsizing to tiny living is that RVs and tiny houses both depreciate in value fast. And, it's not an investment. It's a hobby or it's a lifestyle choice. And it's not necessarily going to be the cheaper option compared to living in an apartment or a home. It is 100% you're doing it because you enjoy it. And just have that in mind before you jump into it without knowing the facts.
Make sure that if you're choosing an RV or a tiny house, you're passionate about it, is basically what we're saying. It's going to be tiny, but it's going to offer you so many other things in return for your downsizing. The flexibility of, having a smaller living space, having less clutter, and being able to travel more is definitely a positive. For us, the RV was always the way to go.
If you're more of somebody who's got a bunch of land and you're homesteading, a tiny house might be more of a concrete option where you can build around it and really flourish in this tiny living space. And I know a lot of people in that community really enjoy living in tiny houses in that situation.
Bottom line, if you choose the right house for you, you can't go wrong. These are just a couple of things that we thought might be helpful for you to consider if you're trying to decide between the 2 different options.
Really, whichever one you decide to do, you can't go wrong. The tiny living lifestyle is very rewarding. It's given us innumerable benefits that I couldn't even begin to delve into at this time. But be sure to, if you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. And as always, subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to make great content just like this. And as always, we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for traveling with us, guys.
Bye.